Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most thankless professions, the medieval doctor, a person who dedicated their life to healing others, armed with almost no real knowledge of how the human body worked. A handful of herbs, some prayers, and a deep, unshakable confidence in theories that were almost entirely wrong. If you've ever had a bad experience at the doctor's office, I assure you, it could have been much, much worse. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's travel back to a time when medicine was equal parts guesswork, religion, and accidental poisoning. To truly understand what it meant to be a doctor in the Middle Ages, we first need to understand the world in which these doctors lived. Picture Europe, somewhere between the years 500 and 1400. The Roman Empire has long since collapsed. The great libraries of the ancient world have been scattered, burned, or forgotten. The roads that once connected a continent have crumbled, and in the middle of all this uncertainty, a new force has risen to organize society, to explain the universe, and to tell people what to think about their own bodies. The church. The church was not opposed to medicine exactly, but it had very specific ideas about why people became sick, and those ideas revolved primarily around sin. Illness, in the medieval Christian worldview, was frequently understood as a punishment from God, or as a trial to be endured with patience and faith. The soul mattered infinitely more than the body. A man who suffered with grace was closer to heaven than a man who sought comfort in earthly remedies. This created an interesting tension for anyone who wanted to practice medicine professionally. You could try to cure the body, but you had better not forget the soul while you were doing it. Many physicians were also clergymen, and many medical treatments were accompanied by prayer, confession, and the administration of sacraments. The church also controlled education. If you wanted to learn anything in medieval Europe, anything at all, you almost certainly did so through institutions connected to the church. Monasteries had libraries, cathedrals had schools, and eventually, beginning around the 12th century, universities began to appear in places like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salerno. These universities were the closest thing the medieval world had to centers of serious intellectual life, and their medical faculties were where the most educated physicians of the era received their training. But here is where things begin to get complicated. What exactly were these medical students learning? The answer, broadly, is that they were learning to read, not to observe patients, not to conduct experiments, not to dissect bodies and understand anatomy. They were learning to read ancient texts, to memorize ancient authorities, and to argue about what those ancient authorities had meant. The entire curriculum was essentially a very elaborate exercise in reading comprehension, conducted in Latin over a period of many years. The two ancient authorities who mattered most were Hippocrates and Galen. Hippocrates, the Greek physician who lived around 400 BC, is often called the father of medicine, and with some reason, he pushed back against the idea that illness was purely supernatural in origin. He argued that disease had natural causes, that the physician should observe the patient carefully, that the body had its own healing powers. These were genuinely important ideas, but Hippocrates lived and worked with almost no real understanding of human anatomy, no microscopes, no concept of bacteria or viruses, and no access to anything resembling modern chemistry. His observations were careful, but his explanations were wrong in ways he could not possibly have known. Galen was a Roman physician who lived around 150 AD and who was, by any measure, one of the most prolific and influential medical writers in history. He wrote millions of words. He conducted dissections, though mostly on animals, not humans, since human dissection was largely forbidden. He synthesized and extended the work of Hippocrates and dozens of other Greek physicians into a vast, comprehensive system. And then, for the next 1,300 years, almost no one in Europe questioned a single word he wrote. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval medicine. It was a deeply conservative discipline, not conservative in the political sense, but conservative in the sense that it looked backward rather than forward. The highest praise you could offer a physician was to say that he had read widely in the ancient sources and faithfully applied what he had learned. Innovation was not valued. Observation that contradicted the ancient authorities was not encouraged. If Galen said that the liver produced blood, then the liver produced blood. And if you opened up a patient and found something that seemed to contradict this, the correct response was to assume that you had misunderstood what you were looking at. Not that Galen had been wrong. The medical students of a 13th century university would spend years studying texts like the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, a Persian physician who had synthesized Greek medical knowledge into a comprehensive and beautifully organized work. They would study Galen's collected writings. They would argue about the meanings of difficult passages. They would debate theoretical questions in formal academic exercises called disputations, and eventually, after many years of this, they would emerge with a degree and a license to practice medicine without having ever treated a single patient in a clinical setting. When this newly graduated physician finally set up his practice, he entered a medical marketplace that was far more crowded and chaotic than anything he might have imagined from his years of quiet reading. He was not the only person offering to heal the sick. Far from it. At the top of the social hierarchy sat the university-trained physician, educated, expensive, and available primarily to the wealthy. Below him in status, but often more practically useful, was the surgeon, who handled cutting, setting bones, extracting teeth, and dealing with wounds. Below the surgeon was the barber surgeon, who cut hair, pulled teeth, let blood, and performed minor operations using more or less the same tools for all of these tasks. Then there were apothecaries, who prepared and sold medicines. There were midwives, who handled childbirth and women's health. There were village healers and wise women and herbalists who had accumulated generations of folk knowledge about plants and remedies. And there were traveling mountebanks and quacks who sold miracle cures at market fairs and moved on before their patients could find them again. The university physician looked down on all of these competitors. He was educated. He had read Galen. He understood, or believed he understood, the deep theoretical foundations of disease and health. But in practice, the sick peasant who could not afford a physician's fee and who lived 3 days' journey from the nearest town was not particularly concerned with the distinction between a trained physician and a local herbalist. He went to whoever was available and whatever he could afford. The physician's tools of diagnosis were limited by modern standards to the point of being almost comical, but they were taken with the utmost seriousness by their practitioners. The physician would examine the patient's urine, and we will have much more to say about urine later in this story, because it played a truly remarkable role in medieval medicine. He would take the patient's pulse, not with any real understanding of what the pulse indicated about the heart or circulatory system, but as a way of assessing the balance of the body's internal forces. He would examine the patient's skin, eyes, and tongue. He would ask about the patient's diet, sleep, emotional state, and recent activities, and then he would consult, if he was being thorough, the patient's astrological chart. Yes, astrology was a genuine part of medical practice in the Middle Ages. The planets were believed to exert real, measurable influence on the human body. Saturn was associated with coldness and melancholy. Mars was associated with heat and aggression. The moon influenced moisture and the tides of the body's internal fluids. A physician who wanted to perform a procedure at the most auspicious time would consult an almanac and plan accordingly. Bloodletting, which we will get to shortly, was not to be performed when the moon was in certain signs of the zodiac. Surgery on specific parts of the body was to be avoided when the moon was in the sign associated with that part. These were not fringe beliefs held by a few eccentric practitioners. They were mainstream. They were taught in universities. They were taken for granted by patients and physicians alike. What bound all of this together? The urine examination, the pulse taking, the astrological consultation, the years of reading Galen, was a single theoretical framework that explained, or seemed to explain, everything. It was called the theory of the four humors, and it was the foundation upon which the entire edifice of medieval medicine was built. To understand what it was like to be a medieval doctor or a medieval patient, you need to understand the humors. The theory of the four humors was not invented in the Middle Ages. It came from the ancient Greeks, and by the time it reached medieval Europe, it had already been refined, debated, and elaborated upon for nearly 1,000 years. Hippocrates had laid the groundwork. Galen had built the cathedral, and medieval physicians moved into that cathedral and decorated every corner of it with extraordinary devotion and detail, never once asking whether the foundation beneath it was solid. The basic idea was this: the human body was governed by four fluids called humors. These fluids were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every function of the body, every state of health or disease, every mood, every personality trait, every chronic condition could be explained by the balance or imbalance of these four substances. When the humors were in proper proportion, the person was healthy. When one humor became excessive, or when another was depleted, illness followed. The job of the physician was to identify which humor was out of balance and to restore the correct equilibrium by whatever means were available. Each humor was associated with a specific organ that produced it. Blood was produced by the liver. Phlegm was produced by the brain. Yellow bile, sometimes called choler, was produced by the gallbladder. Black bile was produced by the spleen. Each humor was also associated with specific qualities drawn from the ancient Greek understanding of the natural world. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. These qualities linked the humors to the four elements: earth, water, fire, and air, and to the four seasons. Blood was associated with spring, yellow bile with summer, black bile with autumn, phlegm with winter. This meant that the time of year was medically relevant. A patient who fell ill in winter was more likely to have an excess of phlegm than one who fell ill in summer. The physician would take the season into account when making his diagnosis. The humors also explained personality. A person with an excess of blood was called sanguine, cheerful, sociable, optimistic, ruddy-cheeked, perhaps a little too fond of eating and drinking. A person with an excess of yellow bile was choleric, quick to anger, ambitious, energetic, easily irritated. A person with an excess of black bile was melancholic, sad, anxious, fearful, prone to depression and dark thoughts. A person with an excess of phlegm was phlegmatic, calm, slow, unemotional, sometimes lethargic. We still use these words today, which tells you something about how deeply this framework penetrated Western culture. When we call someone phlegmatic or say that they are in a good humor, we are using the language of a medical theory that is well over 2,000 years old and has been wrong for most of that time. The four humors were not static. They fluctuated constantly in response to everything the person ate, drank, felt, did, and experienced. Diet was of enormous medical importance because food was believed to affect the humoral balance directly. Certain foods were considered hot and dry, and eating them would increase the hot and dry humors. Other foods were cold and moist. The physician would prescribe dietary changes as a primary treatment for many conditions. A melancholic patient, one suffering from an excess of cold, dry black bile, might be advised to eat foods that were warm and moist. Good wine, warm broths, moderate amounts of meat. A choleric patient suffering from too much hot, dry yellow bile might be told to avoid spicy foods, red meat, and strong wine, and to eat cooling foods like cucumber, lettuce, and white fish. Exercise also affected the humors. Sleep affected the humors. Strong emotions affected the humors. Grief could thicken the blood. Anger could overheat the body. Fear could chill the vital spirits. This meant that the physician was interested in the whole person, their diet, their sleep habits, their emotional life, their occupation, their social circumstances. In this sense, the humoral framework encouraged a kind of holistic attention to the patient that was not entirely without value. A physician who asked about your diet and your sleep and your emotional state was gathering more useful information than one who simply looked at you and declared you cursed. The diagnostic centerpiece of humoral medicine was uroscopy, the examination of urine. This practice was so central to medieval medicine that the image of a physician holding up a flask of urine to the light became the standard symbol of the profession, the way a stethoscope is today. Urine charts were produced showing the different colors and consistencies that urine could take, each associated with a different diagnosis. A physician who received a patient's urine sample could theoretically diagnose the condition without ever seeing the patient at all, and this actually happened regularly. Patients would send a servant to the physician with a flask of urine. The physician would examine it, make his diagnosis, and send back a prescription. The patient might be miles away. What were physicians looking for in the urine? Color was primary. Pale urine suggested a cold, moist condition, too much phlegm perhaps, or insufficient internal heat. Dark urine suggested excess heat or a buildup of bile. Red or bloody urine indicated various alarming conditions. Cloudy urine was often interpreted as a sign of kidney problems. Physicians also examined the consistency, the smell, and, though the sources are somewhat coy about confirming this explicitly, apparently sometimes the taste, the foam at the top of the sample, and the sediment at the bottom were both read for meaning. The entire flask was held up to natural light and scrutinized with great seriousness. Beyond urine, the physician would examine the pulse. But the medieval understanding of the pulse was quite different from our own. Today we understand the pulse as a reflection of the heart's rhythm, and we measure its rate and regularity. Medieval physicians understood the pulse as a much more nuanced phenomenon. Galen had described dozens of distinct pulse types, each with its own name and its own diagnostic significance. There was the hard pulse and the soft pulse, the full pulse and the empty pulse, the frequent pulse and the rare pulse, the regular pulse and the irregular pulse, and many combinations and gradations thereof. A skilled physician could supposedly diagnose a wide range of conditions simply by feeling the wrist and attending carefully to the character of the pulse. This required years of practice and a very fine discrimination. Most physicians probably could not actually do it with any real accuracy, but the theoretical framework was elaborate and taken entirely seriously. The physician would also examine the patient's eyes, the color of the whites, the dilation of the pupils, the quality of the gaze. All of these were meaningful. He would look at the skin and note its color, temperature, and moisture. He would ask about the character of the patient's stools, their appetite, their thirst, their sleep. He would ask whether they had experienced unusual dreams, since dreams were believed to have medical significance. A patient who dreamed of fire might have an excess of yellow bile. A patient who dreamed of water or floods might have an excess of phlegm. And then, as mentioned, there was the astrological dimension. The human body was mapped onto the zodiac in a system called Melothesia. Aries governed the head, Taurus governed the neck and throat, Gemini governed the arms and shoulders, Cancer governed the chest and lungs, Leo governed the heart, Virgo governed the digestive organs, Libra governed the kidneys, Scorpio governed the reproductive organs, Sagittarius governed the thighs, Capricorn governed the knees, Aquarius governed the calves and ankles, Pisces governed the feet. A physician planning to operate on a patient's knee would consult the almanac to ensure that the moon was not currently in Capricorn, because operating on a body part while the moon was in its governing sign was considered dangerous. This was not superstition, held only by the uneducated. It was printed in medical textbooks and taught in universities. The planets also had their associations. The sun was associated with the heart and the vital spirits, the moon with the brain and with moisture throughout the body, Saturn with the spleen and with melancholy, Jupiter with the liver and with good fortune and health, Mars with the gallbladder and with heat and inflammation, Venus with the kidneys and with reproductive health, Mercury with the lungs and with intelligence. A physician who understood these correspondences could, theoretically, use them to time treatments, choose medicines, and interpret symptoms with greater precision, or so the theory went. When a medieval physician had gathered all of this information, the urine examination, the pulse, the skin, the eyes, the stools, the dreams, the astrological chart, the season, the patient's diet and emotional history, he would arrive at a diagnosis. And that diagnosis would almost certainly be expressed in terms of humoral imbalance. The patient had too much blood or too little. The yellow bile was overheated. The phlegm was excessive and had settled in the lungs. The black bile was thick and had moved to the brain, producing melancholy and disturbed sleep. Having identified the imbalance, the physician would then prescribe treatment, and this is where things became genuinely dangerous for the patient, because the treatments available to a medieval physician for correcting humoral imbalance were limited to a small number of approaches, most of which were unpleasant, several of which were harmful, and a few of which were lethal. The logic was impeccable given the theory. If the patient had too much of a humor, you removed it. If the patient had too little, you tried to generate more through diet and rest. The removal of excess humors could be accomplished through purging, through vomiting, through sweating, through the application of heat or cold, and most dramatically and most dangerously, through the removal of blood. Bloodletting was the great therapeutic intervention of medieval medicine. It was used for almost every condition imaginable. It was considered preventive as well as curative. It was performed on healthy people who simply wanted to maintain their humoral balance. It was performed on the very old and the very young, on pregnant women, on people who were already severely weakened by illness. It was, in the medieval physician's toolkit, roughly what antibiotics became in the 20th century, a treatment so broadly applicable that it was reached for first, most often, and with tremendous confidence. The theory behind bloodletting was straightforward. Blood was the dominant humor in the body. It was produced constantly by the liver and consumed constantly by the tissues. When blood became excessive, or when it became corrupt or overheated, it needed to be removed. By taking blood out of the body, the physician reduced the overall humoral burden, cooled the internal heat, and gave the body a chance to restore its natural balance. This made perfect sense within the humoral framework. It made no sense at all in terms of actual physiology, and the consequences for patients were often severe. Bloodletting was performed in two primary ways, and both of them require a moment to sit with before we move on. The first method was phlebotomy, the opening of a vein with a small knife called a lancet. The physician, or more commonly, the barber surgeon, would select a vein, make an incision, and allow the blood to flow into a bowl. The amount removed varied enormously, depending on the condition being treated, the practitioner's confidence, and the theoretical requirements of the case. Sometimes a few ounces were taken, sometimes pints. In cases where the physician believed the condition was severe and the humoral excess was great, the amounts removed could be genuinely shocking by any modern standard. There are historical records of patients having close to 2 liters of blood removed in a single session, nearly half the total blood volume of an average adult human body. The patient, unsurprisingly, would become pale, weak, and sometimes unconscious. The physician would interpret this as a sign that the treatment was working. The excess heat was being expelled. The body was calming down. The patient needed rest. The second method of bloodletting involved leeches, and leeches had certain practical advantages over the lancet. They could be applied to areas of the body where making an incision was difficult or dangerous. They could be placed near the eyes, inside the nose, near the anus, or at the base of the skull. They attached themselves, fed until they were full, and then dropped off, having removed a controlled amount of blood from a specific location. Leeches were available from apothecaries and were a standard item in any medical practice. A physician treating a patient with a severe headache might apply leeches to the temples or behind the ears, on the theory that the excess blood or heat in the head needed to be drawn downward and out. A patient with hemorrhoids might have leeches applied in the opposite direction to draw blood away from the inflamed area. The logic was always humoral, and the leeches went wherever the logic directed them. The third method of blood removal was cupping, the application of heated glass or ceramic cups to the skin. When a cup was heated and placed against the skin, the cooling air inside created a partial vacuum that drew blood and fluid toward the surface, producing large, dramatic bruises and sometimes breaking the skin to allow fluid to escape. Wet cupping, which involved making small cuts in the skin before applying the cups, was considered more effective than dry cupping for actually removing corrupt humors. The marks left by cupping were vivid and alarming to modern eyes, but to a medieval patient, they were a reassuring sign that something was being done, that the treatment was having an effect, that the physician knew what he was about. The selection of the correct site for bloodletting was considered a matter of great technical skill. It was not simply a question of opening whatever vein was most convenient. The body's veins were mapped in relation to the humoral system and to the organs they were believed to serve. The cephalic vein in the arm, for instance, was associated with the head. The basilic vein was associated with the liver and spleen. The median vein was associated with the heart. A physician treating a condition of the liver would open the basilic vein on the right arm. A physician treating a condition of the head would open the cephalic vein. These associations were taught in universities and printed in medical texts, and the physician who followed them believed himself to be engaging in a precise and rational therapeutic intervention rather than simply stabbing his patient in the arm and hoping for the best. Bloodletting was also deeply entangled with the calendar. Certain days of the year were considered auspicious for bloodletting, and others were considered dangerous. The days immediately before and after a new moon were generally avoided. Certain feast days of the church were inappropriate. There were published almanacs specifically designed to help practitioners identify the correct days for bloodletting throughout the year, and these almanacs were consulted seriously and regularly. A patient who arrived seeking to be bled on an inauspicious day might be turned away and told to return when the celestial conditions were more favorable, which from the patient's perspective must have been either reassuring or deeply frustrating depending on the urgency of their condition. Beyond bloodletting, the medieval physician had recourse to a range of other evacuative treatments designed to remove excess humors through other openings of the body. Purging, the use of laxatives to provoke violent emptying of the bowels, was considered a primary treatment for excess yellow bile and black bile in particular. The substances used as laxatives included some that were genuinely effective in producing the desired result, and several that were so violently effective as to be dangerous. Senna, rhubarb, and aloe were used. So were substances like scammony, a resinous plant extract that produced ferocious purgative effects and was powerful enough to cause serious harm if given in excessive doses. The physician who prescribed a purgative was trying to do the right thing within the framework he understood, but the patient who received a large dose of scammony was in for a thoroughly miserable experience that might leave them weaker than they had been before treatment began. Emetics, substances designed to induce vomiting, were used to clear excess humors from the stomach and upper digestive tract. Hellebore, both black and white varieties, was among the most commonly used emetics in the medieval pharmacopoeia. It was also one of the most dangerous. Hellebore contains compounds that are genuinely toxic, and the line between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was not reliably known to medieval practitioners. Patients who were given hellebore sometimes experienced violent vomiting, severe abdominal cramping, dangerously slow heart rate, and in serious cases, death. The physician who prescribed it was not being negligent by the standards of his time. He was following a tradition of practice that stretched back to antiquity. Hellebore had been used as a purgative and emetic for centuries. Galen had written about it. It must therefore be correct. Sweating was another method of humoral evacuation. Excess humors, it was believed, could be driven out through the pores of the skin if the patient was made to sweat sufficiently. Hot baths, heavy blankets, and the administration of hot drinks were used to provoke sweating. Hot rooms, sometimes heated with braziers, were employed. This treatment had a certain intuitive logic. We still speak of sweating out a fever, and the sensation of breaking into a sweat during an illness does sometimes correlate with the beginning of recovery, though not for the reasons a medieval physician would have supposed. In cases where the patient was suffering from a condition that would have resolved on its own regardless of treatment, the sweating therapy could be pronounced a success. In cases where the patient was already dehydrated from fever or illness, forcing additional fluid loss through sweating could make things considerably worse. The enema, known in medieval texts as the clyster, was another standard therapeutic tool. A clyster was a solution injected into the rectum using a syringe or bladder and tube designed to evacuate the lower bowel and to deliver medicines directly to the intestinal tract. The solutions used in clysters varied enormously. Simple warm water was used. So were solutions containing oil, honey, salt, wine, and various herbal preparations. In more aggressive formulations, clysters might contain substances intended to purge vigorously or to stimulate the bowels into activity. The clyster was not considered an indignity or an emergency measure. It was a routine therapeutic intervention prescribed for constipation, for fever, for excessive black bile, for conditions of the lower abdomen, and for various other complaints. Wealthy patients apparently received them with some regularity as a general tonic measure. There are records of prominent historical figures receiving multiple clysters in a single day during acute illness, which raises questions about their physician's judgment that cannot entirely be answered in their favor through all of these treatments: the bloodletting, the purging, the vomiting, the sweating, the clysters. The physician maintained the serene confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And in a sense, he did know what he was doing. He was applying a consistent theoretical framework that had been validated by centuries of use and the authority of the greatest medical minds of the ancient world. If the patient did not improve or worsened, there were explanations available. The treatment had not been aggressive enough. The patient had not followed the dietary restrictions. The astrological timing had been imperfect. The underlying humoral imbalance was more severe than initially apparent. What was never considered, or almost never, was that the framework itself might be wrong. The barber surgeon occupied a peculiar and somewhat uncomfortable position in the medical hierarchy. University-trained physicians considered surgery to be beneath them, a manual trade involving the use of one's hands in ways that were considered unseemly for a learned man. Surgery was therefore largely left to practitioners who had learned their trade through apprenticeship rather than university study, and who often combined surgical work with the other manual services of the barber's trade. The striped pole that still marks barbershops in many countries today is a remnant of this history. The red stripe represents blood. The white stripe represents the bandages used to dress wounds, and the pole itself recalls the rod that patients gripped while having their veins opened to make the blood flow more freely. The barber surgeon could pull teeth, lance boils, set broken bones, stitch wounds, amputate limbs, and perform bloodletting. He worked without anesthesia in any meaningful sense, since the concept of surgical anesthesia would not be developed for another 4 or 5 centuries. A patient undergoing amputation in the Middle Ages was given, at best, a large quantity of wine or a preparation containing opium or henbane, which might blunt the edges of the experience somewhat, but would certainly not eliminate the pain. The operation would then proceed as quickly as possible. Because speed was understood to be a mercy, a skilled amputation surgeon could remove a limb in under a minute. This was not a boast about surgical precision. It was a recognition that the patient's ability to endure the procedure without dying of shock was directly related to how quickly it was completed. The surgical instruments available to the medieval practitioner were not without sophistication. There were knives and scalpels of various sizes, forceps, probes, needles, and thread for suturing, bone saws, and a variety of specialized tools for particular procedures. The quality of the metalwork was often quite good by the standards of the era. What was entirely absent was any understanding of infection. The surgeon who wiped his blade on the hem of his robe between patients, who probed a wound with unwashed fingers, who applied a dressing that had been used on a previous patient, was not being careless. He simply had no concept that the invisible agents responsible for wound infection existed. The germ theory of disease was 400 years in the future. In the meantime, wounds that became infected were explained as evidence of corrupt humors, and the treatment for an infected wound was frequently more of whatever had been done already: more purging, more bleeding, more evacuation of the humoral excess that was clearly responsible for the patient's deteriorating condition. The world of medieval herbal medicine was vast, ancient, and deeply serious. To dismiss it entirely as superstition would be unfair. Some of what medieval herbalists knew about plants was genuinely useful, accumulated over centuries of careful observation and passed down through generations of practitioners who had watched with their own eyes which preparations seemed to help and which seemed to harm. But to suggest that medieval herbal medicine was a reliable or coherent system of treatment would be equally misleading. It was a mixture of genuine botanical knowledge, classical theory, magical thinking, religious symbolism, and pure invention, held together by the same humoral framework that governed everything else in medieval medicine, and applied with the same confidence and the same fundamental misunderstanding of how disease actually worked. The primary text governing herbal medicine in medieval Europe was a work called the Herbarium, attributed to a Roman author named Apuleius Platonicus and compiled sometime in late antiquity. This was supplemented by Dioscorides, a Greek physician from the 1st century AD who had written a comprehensive catalog of medicinal plants called De Materia Medica, which remained the standard reference work on the subject for over 1,000 years. Beyond these classical sources, there were hundreds of local traditions, monastic herb gardens with their accumulated practical knowledge, and the wisdom of village healers who had never read a word of Dioscorides, but who knew perfectly well that willow bark reduced fever and that chamomile calmed the stomach. Each plant in the medieval pharmacopoeia was assigned a set of qualities drawn from the humoral system. A plant could be hot or cold, moist or dry, and it could possess these qualities in varying degrees of intensity: 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree, or 4th degree. A plant that was hot in the 3rd degree and dry in the 2nd degree would be prescribed to counteract conditions characterized by coldness and moisture, that is, conditions caused by excess phlegm. A plant that was cold and moist would be used to cool and moisten a patient suffering from excessive yellow bile or overheated blood. The physician who prescribed herbal treatments was not simply reaching for whatever grew in the garden. He was, in theory, making a precise therapeutic calculation based on the nature of the patient's humoral imbalance and the known qualities of the available plants. Some of these plants worked. Willow bark, as mentioned, contains salicylic acid, the active compound that aspirin is derived from, and it genuinely does reduce fever and relieve pain. Opium poppies contain compounds that genuinely do reduce pain and induce sleep. Digitalis, derived from the foxglove plant, has real effects on the heart that are still exploited in modern medicine. Though the medieval practitioner who used it had no understanding of why it worked and frequently gave doses that were far too high. Honey has genuine antimicrobial properties. Garlic has some genuine antibacterial effects. These things worked not because of the humoral theory that explained them, but in spite of it, because the plants themselves contained compounds that interacted with human physiology in ways that the medieval physician had no conceptual framework to understand. But for every plant that worked, there were dozens that did not, and several that actively caused harm. The doctrine of signatures was a particularly colorful example of the kind of thinking that led medieval herbalists astray. This doctrine held that God had marked plants with visual signs indicating their medicinal uses. A plant with yellow flowers or yellow sap was therefore useful for treating conditions of the liver and gallbladder, because yellow bile was associated with those organs. A plant whose root resembled a human figure, like mandrake, must have broad medicinal powers related to the human body as a whole. Lungwort, a plant whose leaves are spotted and somewhat resemble lung tissue, was prescribed for lung conditions. Eyebright, a small flower with a dark spot that resembled a pupil, was prescribed for eye conditions. Walnuts, whose inner kernel somewhat resembles a human brain, were considered good for head complaints. The doctrine of signatures was visually intuitive, spiritually satisfying. It suggested a providential universe in which God had thoughtfully labeled his pharmacy and medically useless. The apothecary was the figure responsible for actually preparing and dispensing medicines, and the apothecary's shop was one of the most interesting and aromatic establishments in any medieval town. Shelves lined with jars and bottles contained dried herbs, mineral preparations, animal products of various descriptions, and exotic imported substances that arrived via the trade routes from the Islamic world and beyond. The apothecary might stock cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, camphor from Borneo, and musk from the Himalayan deer. All of these were considered medicinal. All of them were expensive, and all of them were prescribed by physicians who believed in their therapeutic properties with complete sincerity. Among the most celebrated and elaborate preparations in the medieval apothecary's repertoire was theriac, sometimes called Venice treacle. In its most prestigious form, theriac was a compound preparation that allegedly contained dozens of ingredients. Some recipes called for more than 60, including viper flesh, opium, and a wide range of herbs and minerals. It was believed to be a universal antidote against all poisons and a general cure for a wide range of diseases. Its origins went back to antiquity. It was supposedly developed by Mithridates VI of Pontus, a king so paranoid about being poisoned that he spent years developing and testing antidotes on condemned prisoners. Galen had written extensively about theriac and had apparently been quite proud of his own recipe. In the medieval period, theriac was produced commercially in certain cities, most famously Venice, where the preparation of the mixture was a public ceremony conducted by licensed apothecaries and witnessed by civic officials to guarantee its authenticity. It was extraordinarily expensive and universally respected. It almost certainly did nothing useful for any condition it was ever prescribed to treat, apart from the opium it contained, which would at least have made the patient feel somewhat better in the short term. Mercury was another substance whose medical career in the Middle Ages was long, distinguished, and deeply unfortunate for the patients who received it. Mercury and its compounds were used to treat a wide range of conditions and became particularly prominent as a treatment for syphilis after that disease appeared in Europe at the end of the 15th century. The reasoning, such as it was, drew on the idea that mercury's powerful effects on the body, it could cause profuse sweating, salivation, and the loosening of the teeth, demonstrated that it was driving corrupt humors out through the body surfaces. A patient being treated with mercury for syphilis might produce several pints of saliva per day, lose their teeth, develop sores in their mouth and throat, and suffer neurological damage from mercury poisoning. The physicians who administered these treatments believed the dramatic symptoms were evidence that the treatment was working. Some patients may have temporarily improved from the syphilis while the mercury treatment was ongoing, because mercury does have some antibacterial properties. Others simply died of mercury poisoning instead of syphilis, which was not generally considered an improvement. Arsenic, lead compounds, and antimony were similarly used as medicines throughout the medieval and early modern period, each with its own theoretical justification and its own roster of patients who were harmed by the treatment intended to help them. The physician who prescribed these substances was not malicious. He was working within the best understanding available to him, consulting the most authoritative texts, following the advice of teachers and predecessors whose knowledge he had every reason to respect. The tragedy of medieval medicine is not that it was practiced by cruel or stupid people. It was practiced, for the most part, by genuinely intelligent and dedicated people who happened to be working with a completely wrong theoretical framework and no means of recognizing that it was wrong. The role of smell in medieval medical thinking deserves particular attention because it led to some interesting therapeutic practices that are worth understanding in their own right. The prevailing theory about how disease spread through populations, the miasma theory, held that disease was caused by bad air, specifically by air that had been corrupted by rotting organic matter, stagnant water, decaying bodies, or other sources of foul odor. When plague swept through a medieval city, killing a third or more of the population, the medical explanation was miasma. The air itself had become poisonous, and breathing it was what made people sick. This was wrong in its specifics. Plague is caused by a bacterium transmitted by fleas on rats, not by bad air. But it was not entirely without foundation as an observation, since areas with poor sanitation and rotting organic matter were indeed more likely to harbor disease. The therapeutic implication of miasma theory was that good smells could counteract bad ones, and that surrounding yourself with pleasant aromas was a legitimate form of disease prevention. Physicians visiting plague patients would carry pomanders, small decorative containers filled with aromatic herbs and spices, and hold them to their noses while examining the sick. The famous plague doctor's costume, with its long beak-shaped mask, was designed to hold aromatic herbs in the beak, creating a kind of primitive filter between the physician and the miasmatic air. This was not entirely foolish. The costume also covered the physician's skin and reduced the chances of flea bites, which was actually relevant to plague transmission, even though no one understood why. Fumigation of sick rooms with burning herbs and aromatic woods was practiced on the theory that the good smell would drive out the bad air. People were advised to carry herbs on their persons, to strew sweet-smelling plants on floors, and to burn incense in their homes. During times of epidemic, the assessment of urine had by this point in our story become familiar territory, but it is worth noting that urine was not merely examined by medieval physicians. It was also used as a medicine in its own right. Fresh urine was applied to wounds on the theory that it had cleansing properties, which is not entirely wrong. Urine is sterile when it leaves the body, and applying it to a wound was probably no worse than many of the alternatives available. Aged urine, in which the urea had broken down into ammonia, was used for skin conditions and as a bleaching agent. Some preparations called for urine to be drunk as a treatment for various internal conditions. The physician who recommended drinking urine was drawing on a classical tradition that stretched back to antiquity, and he was doing so with the confidence of a man who had read widely and thought carefully about what he had read. The patient who followed this advice was doing what patients do, trusting the expert, hoping for the best, and trying not to think too hard about what was being asked of them. What is perhaps most remarkable about all of this? The mercury and the arsenic, the theriac with its 60 ingredients, the urine drinking and the clysters, the leeches behind the ears, and the cupping glasses on the back, is that patients kept coming back. Medieval medicine did not collapse under the weight of its own failures. People continued to consult physicians, to pay apothecaries for their preparations, to undergo bloodletting and purging, and the application of foul-smelling poultices. There are a few reasons for this. One is that many diseases resolve on their own regardless of treatment, and when they did, the physician received the credit. Another is that the placebo effect is real and powerful, and a confident practitioner who takes your condition seriously and prescribes an elaborate course of treatment can genuinely make you feel better, even if the treatment itself is doing nothing. A third is that medieval people had no alternative framework. They could not compare their physicians' methods to anything better. They had no way of knowing that the bloodletting was making them weaker rather than stronger, and so they trusted, and they suffered, and they recovered, or they did not, and life went on in its medieval way, with the physicians doing their best and the patients enduring whatever that best happened to require of them. Okay, Fassa Part Final 1008. The life of a medieval physician was not, by any measure, an easy one. We have spent considerable time discussing what he did to his patients, and it is only fair to spend some time now considering what life did to him. The education alone was enough to discourage all but the most determined. A young man who wished to become a university-trained physician in medieval Europe would typically begin his studies in his mid to late teens. Having already acquired a foundation in Latin and the basics of the liberal arts, he would then spend anywhere from 5 to 10 years at a medical faculty, reading Galen and Avicenna and Hippocrates, attending lectures, participating in disputations, and gradually working his way through the enormous body of classical and Arabic medical literature that formed the core curriculum. He would emerge from this process in his mid to late 20s, deeply learned in texts that were largely wrong and almost entirely without practical clinical experience. This was not considered a deficiency. The university model of medical education was built on the assumption that knowledge flowed from books and from the authorities who had written them. A physician who had mastered the texts had mastered medicine. Practical experience would come later, accumulated over years of practice, but it was the theoretical foundation that mattered most. A physician who could not explain the humoral basis of a patient's condition, who could not situate the case within the framework of classical medical theory, who could not cite the relevant authorities. Such a physician was not truly educated, regardless of how many patients he had treated or how many of them had recovered. The cost of this education was considerable. Universities charged fees. Books were expensive. In an era before printing, a single medical text might cost as much as a horse. Living expenses in a university town over 5 or 10 years represented a substantial investment. Most university-trained physicians came from families with the resources to support a son through years of expensive education, which meant that the learned physician was typically a man of some social standing. Before he ever began his studies, he was not drawn from the poorest ranks of society. He was, in most cases, the son of a merchant, a minor noble, or a prosperous craftsman, someone whose family could afford to wait years for a return on their investment. When he finally set up practice, the physician entered a world of considerable social complexity. His status was relatively high. He was an educated man, a university graduate, a person who could read Latin and cite ancient authorities. He moved in elevated social circles. He treated wealthy patients, powerful patients, patients who could afford his fees, and who expected to be treated with the deference owed to important people. The physician who served a great noble household occupied a position of genuine privilege. He ate at the high table. He received gifts as well as fees. He traveled with his patron. He had access to resources and opportunities unavailable to most of his contemporaries. But the physician's social position was also deeply precarious in ways that his education had not prepared him for. The most fundamental problem was this: his patients frequently died, not because he was incompetent, or not only because of that, but because disease in the medieval world was genuinely deadly, because the conditions that brought people to the physician were often conditions that could not be cured by any means available in the 14th century, and because the treatments he applied sometimes accelerated the decline of patients who might otherwise have lingered longer. When a patient died under a physician's care, the physician was not automatically absolved of responsibility. He might be blamed by the family. He might face legal consequences in some jurisdictions. He might lose his reputation, which was the most valuable thing he possessed. The medieval physician therefore developed a set of strategies for managing the risk of treating difficult cases, and these strategies were not always in the patient's best interest. One common approach was prognosis management, the art of predicting outcomes in ways that protected the physician regardless of what happened. If the physician predicted that the patient would die and the patient recovered, the physician was a miracle worker. If the physician predicted recovery and the patient died, he was a fraud. The rational strategy, therefore, was to be pessimistic in prognosis while appearing optimistic in treatment. Tell the family it was very serious, that you were doing everything possible, that you had great hopes but could make no promises. This way, recovery was a triumph, and death was a tragedy that no one could have prevented. Another strategy was the careful selection of patients. A physician who took on only those cases where the patient was likely to recover, regardless of treatment, would maintain an impressive record of success. A patient who arrived with an obviously fatal condition, late-stage cancer, severe trauma, advanced plague, was better refused on some pretext than accepted and allowed to die under the physician's care. There are medieval medical texts that frankly discuss the ethics and practicalities of patient selection, advising physicians on how to recognize hopeless cases and withdraw from them gracefully before becoming responsible for the outcome. The plague presented the medieval physician with the ultimate test of his professional commitments, and many physicians failed it in ways that were understandable, but not particularly admirable. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and began killing between a third and half of the population, the physicians of the era found themselves confronted with a disease they could not explain, could not treat, and could not escape. Their humoral theories offered no useful guidance. Their herbal preparations did nothing. Their bloodletting weakened patients who were already dying, and the disease itself spread in ways that made treating patients extraordinarily dangerous for the practitioner. Many physicians fled. This was not universal. There were physicians who stayed and worked heroically among the sick, knowing they were likely to die themselves. But flight was common enough to be remarked upon by contemporaries with considerable bitterness. The people who most needed medical help were abandoned by the people whose professional identity was defined by providing it. The physicians who remained sometimes wore elaborate protective costumes and carried their aromatic pomanders and maintained their professional dignity while being utterly unable to help the people dying before them. It was perhaps the starkest possible illustration of the gap between the elaborate theoretical framework of medieval medicine and the reality of disease as it actually existed in the world. The unlicensed competitors who filled the spaces left by trained physicians during the plague, the village healers, the wise women, the traveling mountebanks, offered treatments that were no less effective than those of the university physicians, which is to say, they were not effective at all, but they were often cheaper and more available and accompanied by a warmth and familiarity that the distant, learned physician sometimes failed to provide. The patient dying of plague, who was visited by a neighbor who brought warm broth and held their hand, was perhaps better served, in human terms, than the patient who received a learned consultation and a prescription for theriac, and was then left to the care of servants, while the physician moved on to the next paying customer. The relationship between medicine and the church remained complicated throughout the medieval period. On one hand, the church provided the institutional framework within which medical education took place, and many physicians were also clergymen. On the other hand, the church was suspicious of practices that seemed to encroach on theological territory. Healing was God's business as much as it was the physician's, and a physician who claimed too much power over life and death might find himself in theological difficulty. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 issued a decree requiring physicians to call in a priest before treating seriously ill patients, on the grounds that the health of the soul was more important than the health of the body, and that a patient who died without confession was in considerably worse shape spiritually than one who had simply failed to recover from a fever. Surgery occupied a particularly ambiguous position in relation to the church. A decree that is often summarized as Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine, the church abhors blood, was interpreted by some authorities as prohibiting clergymen from performing surgery, which contributed to the separation between the learned physician, who often had clerical connections, and the barber surgeon, who did not. Whether this decree was as broadly applied as is sometimes claimed is debated by historians, but its cultural effect was real. It reinforced the idea that cutting and bleeding were manual trades rather than intellectual ones, and that the truly educated practitioner should concern himself with theory and diagnosis rather than with the messy practical business of operating on bodies. Women occupied a complex and largely marginalized position in medieval medicine. They were almost entirely excluded from university education and therefore from the highest ranks of the medical profession. But they were not absent from healing. Midwifery was almost entirely a female domain. The care of the sick within the household was primarily the work of women. Herbalism and the preparation of domestic remedies was women's knowledge, passed from mother to daughter over generations. In some areas, particularly in southern Italy, there are records of women practicing medicine in ways that went beyond the domestic sphere, and the figure of Trotula, a female physician associated with the medical school of Salerno in the 11th or 12th century, whether legendary or historical, represented the possibility of female medical authority, even in a world that systematically excluded women from formal education. The village healer, whether male or female, operated in a world that the university physician rarely entered. In the vast rural spaces of medieval Europe, where a trained physician might be days away, and his fees unimaginable to most of the population, the local healer was the primary resource for the sick. These healers worked with the plants that grew nearby, with remedies that had accumulated over generations, with prayers and charms, and practical interventions that mixed what we would now call folk medicine with what we would call magic in ways that were not clearly distinguished at the time. Some of what they did was harmful, some of it was useless, and some small portion of it was genuinely helpful, not because of the theoretical framework, which was wrong, but because centuries of observing what happened when you gave people certain plants had produced a practical knowledge that sometimes, by accident, corresponded to something real. And so we arrive, gently, at the end of our long journey through the medical world of the Middle Ages. We have met the university physician with his Latin texts and his urine flask, peering at samples by the light of a candle and consulting his astrological almanac before scheduling the bloodletting. We have met the barber surgeon with his striped pole and his lancets and his willingness to cut wherever cutting seemed necessary, without anesthesia and without any understanding of infection. We have visited the apothecary's shop with its jars of theriac and its bundles of dried herbs and its small quantities of mercury and arsenic, all carefully labeled and all available for a price. We have followed the plague doctor in his beaked mask through streets where a third of the population lay dying and watched him hold his pomander to his face and feel the miasmatic air pressing against his costume, and understood that he was doing what he could with what he had. What is perhaps most worth carrying away from all of this is not the wrongness of medieval medicine, though it was wrong, profoundly and consequentially wrong, in ways that killed many people who might otherwise have survived. What is worth carrying away is the sincerity. These were not villains. They were not fools, or not primarily fools. They were men and women who took suffering seriously, who spent years educating themselves in the best knowledge available to them, who sat beside the sick and tried to help, who developed elaborate systems of thought, because elaborate systems of thought were the best tool they had for making sense of a world that was genuinely mysterious and genuinely terrifying. The physician who bled his patient until the patient fainted believed he was doing the right thing. The apothecary who prepared his theriac with 60 ingredients believed those ingredients mattered. The plague doctor who fled the city believed, perhaps, that he was preserving himself to help others another day. Whether we find these justifications adequate is perhaps less important than recognizing that the people who made them were human, recognizably human, doing what humans do when they are frightened and uncertain and trying their best. Medicine today is not the final word. We know this if we are honest. The treatments that seem self-evident and scientifically validated today will be looked back upon by physicians 500 years from now with some of the same mixture of sympathy and disbelief with which we look back at the humoral system and the bloodletting and the theriac. The history of medicine is a history of being wrong in ways we could not yet recognize, and of gradually, imperfectly, at great cost, becoming less wrong. The medieval physician was a very early chapter in that story, a chapter filled with suffering and error and genuine human care, preserved now in the old texts and the surgical instruments in museum cases and the faint linguistic traces that remain whenever we describe someone as sanguine or melancholy or in good humor. And with that, I will let you drift off. You have survived tonight's history lesson in considerably better shape than most medieval patients survived their doctor's visit. The air around you is, I can assure you, entirely free of miasma. Your humors, whatever their current balance, are your own business, and no physician with a lancet is coming to correct them tonight. The world outside is quiet. Whatever ails you, it is nothing that a little rest will not help, and rest is the one prescription that the medieval physician and the modern one have always agreed upon. Sleep well, and we will see you next time